Hello, how are you this afternoon?
Hello, hello, hello.
I'll dive right in.
Let's do it.
I'd like to start this panel by asking the question, not is tech inherently racist, because I think we've all agreed as we talked backstage, nothing is inherently racist, right? What I'd love to discuss is first, please introduce yourselves, tell the crowd what it is that you do, but then also what it is you narrow down what you think are some of the nuances, complexifiers, if I might use that new word, that might lead someone to use the phrase inherently racist.
No, I love that. So excited to be here with you on this panel. I am Kelly Burton. I am the CEO of Black Innovation Alliance. We are a national coalition of innovative support organizations that support Black tech founders, business owners, and creative technologists who are working with emerging media. There are 86 organizations that are part of the Black Innovation Alliance, and they support approximately 300,000 entrepreneurs and innovators of color in greater than 24 cities. And so this question is really fascinating. I wrestled with this one a little bit. What we know is that when we think about tech and the financial infrastructure for tech, that's venture capital. Is venture capital racist? Venture capital is not anti-racist. In that the VC world knows about the systemic inequities that exist in terms of the amount of venture capital that is being deployed to people of color and women. Less than 1% of venture capital goes to Black founders. They know it. There's a recent article in tech, I think in Crunchbase, that says that the number has gone down even since the racial uprising. And so venture capital is very slow to respond to the systemic inequities within this space. So that's what I would say. I don't know about inherently racist, to your point,
yes,
but they are definitely showing no behavior around being anti-racist.
Yeah. So I am delighted to be here alongside Kelly and Veena. My name is Veena Dubal, and I am a professor of law at the University of California in San Francisco, in the heart of sort of the tech economy. Kelly talked a little bit about what's sort of going on at the top, the ways in which the venture capital structures funnel money into particular places and into particular bodies. What I'm interested in is what's happening at the very bottom. There are two ways in which race gets talked about most prolifically in the tech community. One is in terms of DEI. Who is in the C-suite, and what do those people look like? And is the outcome, the predictive outcomes of surveillance technology hurting particular people? So is the business model bad? What I am interested in, conversely, is who is at the very bottom of the tech infrastructure. And this is something that just does not get talked about in tech. Who is collecting the data? Who is labeling the data? And who is moderating the data? Who are the workers? And by and large, we're talking about a global economy of subordinated racial minority workers, both within the global north and sort of the poorest of poor in Asia, Africa, and South America. And so when we think about technology and racism, I think it's really important to bring it back to the global infrastructure, and not just sort of what's happening at the very top, but what are the working conditions of people at the very bottom? How is value being created here, and what does it look like here? What are the people's lives upon whom all of this is growing, all of this is building? What do those people's lives look like? And data is not cotton. It is absolutely not cotton, and I don't want to make that analogy, but it is useful to think about how cotton empires, how cotton was picked by chattel slavery in the US South, how that cotton, that labor, that cruel, violent labor was then used in the Manchester and Bombay mills in colonized India, where my grandfather worked, to make cloth that was then purchased in Europe. And what those cycles of subordinated labor look like, and what kind of world that left us with when we think about the kind of world that technology infrastructures are creating today.
Let's take that just a step further. You make the analogy to cotton, which is not meant to be blithe, but is also meant to deal with, this is an import, this is a product that needs to be dealt with a certain way, and thus perhaps might create a system that is inherently racist. Can you talk just a little bit more about who it is we find at that data collection layer?
Yep. Let me talk about what's going on in San Francisco. So you don't even have to go to Bombay or to Johannesburg to think about these structures. In San Francisco, you have a huge AI industry around what people like to call self-driving cars. Now, the reality of self-driving cars, I think, for a long time has been an advertising message about this imaginary tech future where we weren't going to have a servant class of people driving us. We weren't going to have a public infrastructure of transportation. We were going to have just these fantastical vehicles driving us around. This does not seem possible, or at least every 5 years we're told that maybe it'll happen in the next 5 years. However, the self-driving car, the data, the Waymo data that you see these vehicles all over San Francisco collecting reels and reels and reels of data to feed into the machine learning that eventually is advancing this sort of imaginary of a self-driving car future. The people who are driving those vehicles to collect that data belong to a staffing agency that was created entirely for Google. The structure here is a fissured one. So instead of Google hiring those workers directly, providing them benefits, giving them the opportunity to unionize, to increase and better their working conditions and wages, these people work for a staffing agency. They are at the very bottom of the rung. That data then goes to a labeling farm in Madagascar or in Bangalore, where people are paid sometimes not even by the hour, but by the piece to label the data that then feeds the AI machines. Meanwhile, the people who are actually doing transportation work, the Uber drivers and the taxi workers in San Francisco who are moving people's bodies, maybe some of your bodies right now, are earning about 1/3 of the local minimum wage. Because big tech, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart sponsored a law in 2020 that created a subordinated tier of workers, 78% of whom are racial minority and immigrants in San Francisco, who do the actual transportation work, who again are earning on average $6 an hour in one of the most expensive places in the world. That's the kind of racism and tech that I want to be talking about, and that concerns me.
But Kelly, I can't help but think that the point that Veena makes directly ties to the fact that we have so few founders of color and female founders.
Right.
There is a connection there. Do you see it?
Well, I think for us at Black Innovation Alliance and many of the folks that our members serve, it comes down to the money. It comes down to the capital. It comes down to financing. And I believe that venture capital is broken. We don't even talk about the fact that 9 out of 10 venture-backed startups fail. 9 out of 10. I don't know any other space or demographic other than white men, because white men are the ones that predominantly benefit from venture capital. Approximately 95% of all venture capital in the United States goes to white male-led startups.
And
right?
then 90% of that
Fail.
Yes.
So I have a good colleague who said, essentially, venture capital is philanthropy for white men. Because there's no other population for which that would be acceptable or sustainable, right? We know that diverse-led startups are more successful. But the data has not caused the venture capital community to change their behavior. So the question is, what is going to get them to do anything differently? It's not even, we like to say that people who care about money care about the business case. Well, we've given you the business case, and you still have not changed, right? And so it bears the question, what will it take? And that I do not know. Part of me thinks it will take the model to fail and for people to lose a lot of money in order for it to change. We like to think that venture capital is like the only way, but it's not. It's really a model that's been around for 50 years. And we can choose a different model. We can build a different model. We don't have to be stuck with a model that wastes tremendous capital and prioritizes a very small few.
Which is, again, brings us back to the people who are gathering the data, right? This is a model that depends on paying them 1/3 of the minimum wage in a city like San Francisco, right? Is there a way from this level that we can perhaps influence the model that Kelly is talking about? Is there pressure?
Yes, so since roughly the 1970s, we have moved to a model of capitalism that not only benefits primarily shareholders. It's sort of hard to imagine that there was a world in which that wasn't the primary goal. But to a world that primarily benefits shareholders, and since the 1990s, a world that primarily, maybe the 2000s, a world that primarily benefits shareholders through data sale and surveillance. So this is at the core of the business model of tech. Then what can we do to change it, aside from perhaps changing people at the top who are thinking differently? How do you change the infrastructure so to motivate the people at the top, once they're there, to do things differently? And history has suggested that the best way to change structures of power is by building power elsewhere. And so we see really robust labor movements, not just in the US, where we have, of course, burgeoning labor movement in the Amazon warehouses, amongst Starbucks baristas, just a few years ago within Google itself, among the white-collar workers who were working through staffing agencies, most of whom, I should say, were minority workers. They were not being hired full-time by Google, getting the same benefits as everyone else. And so I think that it does take robust labor organizing to push back on these structures, and we are seeing them in some of those places. But let me just give you an example of how this can go wrong. I was on the collision stage this summer in Toronto, talking alongside the CEO of Sama AI. Sama AI, a few years ago when they were founded as good tech. This is CEO, a woman of color, sitting alongside me, talking about how they use a model that is different from most content moderating companies. They almost exclusively get their profit via Facebook. Their workers are all over the global south, including in Kenya. But as I was sitting next to her, I asked her, your company was on the cover of Time magazine just a few months ago because you were union busting. And this was a good company. This was supposedly a company that had this wonderful business model where they were treating their workers right. And you were on the cover of an international magazine with allegations that you were doing the exact opposite. And how can we live with both of these things, sort of the cover of good tech, when really at the core, again, the business model is about exploitation? And she gave her rote answer, very dissatisfying answer. Meanwhile, her workers are suing her in the global south in Africa. I thought about it for a long time afterwards. I mean, this wasn't a bad person. This didn't start as a bad company, but again, the core motivation of the companies is to benefit their shareholders. And that structure has to change. And it's very difficult to build these labor movements when it is those same companies that are doing the union busting. The same companies that are doing the exploitation, that are doing the union busting. And so I think it's very, very key and important to build these sort of infrastructures, this power at the grassroots level, but also with the acknowledgement at a higher level that this is going to mean that the CEOs aren't going to make as much money, the shareholders aren't going to make as much money, and it's going to involve power sharing and actual profit sharing.
Kelly, and that seems to tie into the work that you're doing.
Yes.
Expanding the conversation on the top down. Can you talk about the programs that you're bringing in to disrupt that line of thinking so we can change the business model?
Of course. At Black Innovation Alliance, our goal is to build a network of networks so that we're ultimately able to build people power. Because what we know is that for the most part, entrepreneurs, generally speaking, are not organized. Innovators are not organized, and innovators and entrepreneurs of color are not organized. We are currently in the process of developing a policy agenda. Earlier this year, we helped Congress launch a congressional caucus on Black innovation because we want to bring this conversation to the streets. The folks who are in our community, in our network, they want to be activated around these issues. They want to plug in. They want to be empowered. They want to get the tools, the strategies, the tactics, the resources so that they can advocate for themselves. Yes. And so that's what we are working to do, to create the infrastructure and the technology that allows us to aggregate people and provide them the tools and the resources so that they can do that for themselves.
And so speaking to this crowd and a crowd out there in the ether, what would you say in terms of getting those circumstances for themselves? Where would you have them go first? Should they come to you?
Well, you know, at Black Innovation Alliance, we're 2 years old. That's what I tell folks all the time. We're a one really grown-ass 2-year-old. In that we do a lot, and people look and they assume that we've been around a lot longer than we have. Yes. We are in the process of building the infrastructure that allows us to do just that. So that if you are an entrepreneur of color, and let's say you're early stage fintech founder, that you can go to our website at blackinnovationalliance.com, answer a few questions, and get a blueprint or a roadmap to help you kind of navigate through the journey, because being an entrepreneur is very lonely, it's very perilous. There's not a lot of signage or wayfinding. There's just a bunch of bumping around. And so when you're dealing with the community in the United States, we talk about this racial wealth gap. There's a 228-year racial wealth gap in the States, which means that it's going to take 228 years for Black families to catch up to the wealth of white families. And as we all know, if you're in a foot race, you can't run that fast. Right? There's not enough working harder, running faster that is going to help you catch up. You need jet fuel. You need something that's going to enable you to leapfrog, which means that we need to remove as much of the friction from the experience of being an entrepreneur of color from the process as possible. So that is what we are focusing on at Black Innovation Alliance, the advocacy, the policy, the research to deliver the insights to the space. So when there are corporations that want to fund this work, it's data-based and they're just not spinning out ideas. You know, every corporation wants to create an accelerator for Black folks. Well, that's great. Do we know that's what they need? Can we start with the data and the intel to say, if you've got $5 million, $10 million, $20 million, there might be a better way for you to deploy it than what you think you should do. Let's give you some data to help you inform that. Capacity building, so building the leadership capabilities of our leaders and their organizations, and narrative change. So Black Innovation Alliance has a booth here at Web Summit. It's a content studio, content lounge, and we're actually recording a podcast. We're doing interviews. We're having conversations because we want to own our own story. There's some really ugly stereotypes about Black folks, about Black business, about what it means, what our capabilities are. And so we want to push back against that by creating the sort of narratives that tell the true story about the diversity of opportunity and capabilities within our community.
And we don't have a lot of time left. These programs, I think, will begin to make some change in founder suites, right? But I can't help but think, Professor, that we are slightly implicated in the system that you are talking about. For instance, we are in these cars driven by these Uber drivers. Is it that we're going to have to accept that we have to pay more for these services?
100%. We need a different model than the one that we have now. You are paying for these services with giving up a lot of choice and a lot of freedom that's invisible through this sort of model of surveillance capitalism, and at the same time you are assenting to the really horrific exploitative business models upon which these systems are built. I always say you would not hold a Bangladeshi worker in your basement to make your cheap clothes, but likely you buy from companies who use those workers in these horrible working conditions, and you wear those clothes without thinking twice. And I think that same analogy goes to all of the tech that you use. And that is not to just cripple you as a consumer, to feel like you can't use these services, to feel like you can't use social media. That doesn't take us anywhere. It is a grift to imagine that you can live ethically in the consumer society that we've built. What you can do is build ethical relationships, support solidarity, support unionism, support class organizing, support mutual aid networks. These are ways that you can build power from the bottom. And if I could give some advice, offer some advice to, the Black innovation entrepreneurs or others of you in the audience who are hoping to be sort of startup founders, think differently about who's on your board. Why not put workers on your board from the very beginning to force you to think about the conditions of the company, the working conditions that your company is fostering, whether in the global south or the global north? And I would just maybe put to you as a thought experiment. In the 1970s, with the growth of the feminist movement in the global north, in Europe and the US, there was a sense that if we just had women in power, we wouldn't have another Vietnam. We wouldn't have a third world war. And Margaret Thatcher proved us wrong. It wasn't just that we needed women in power. Even more recently, Aung San Suu Kyi has proven us wrong, despite her commitment, years and years and years commitment to human rights. It is not the people that are going to, the very top, that are going to change these infrastructures by themselves. It is going to be a groundswell of all of us through our relationships and through our solidarities that are necessarily going to change the conditions of the world in which we live.
When you're talking about, thank you, this exact point, does this come up when you're talking about capacity building, when you're working with leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, in terms of building from the ground up a more equitable system?
I mean, when we think about the startups, our startups are more likely to be in the social enterprise space because people of color are more proximate to the challenges that capitalism has created. And so our experience is very different. I think about Theranos. I'm like, that must be nice to be able to swindle people out of hundreds of millions of dollars. And black folks would never get that kind of opportunity, right?
Right.
And so we're dealing with a whole other different set of challenges, a lot of scarcity, people of color are dealing disproportionately with trauma. So there are a lot of things that they're processing and unpacking in addition to being a startup founder. And so it's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You have to figure out how to be viable, and I think it's important for us to have these conversations about how we can incorporate that thinking from the very beginning, but also to be kind of pragmatic about the realities that founders of color face that are very different and distinct from the kind of the folks who are running these large-scale startups today and are behind a lot of the chicanery that is happening within this broader space.
Complex subject. We could talk about this all afternoon, but thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Very trenchant and important points. Thank you very much.
Awesome.